Let's talk about the real world for a moment, shall we? Where you're not some wonderful lone wolf hero, but you're part of a team and you play your position, because that's what America is, Mr. Jeffries. It's one big team. Now, this might be difficult for you to grasp, but I am a patriot. And a patriot is one who makes the right moral choice. Sometimes it takes a strong man to make that choice.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network and also at 21stCenturyWire.com. And before the break, we were talking about, well, as we said, not quite the post-mortem of the 2020 elections, but we're in a very strange place at the moment. In the interim, potentially, we have two parallel presidencies right now. One country, two presidents. And joining me on the line, of course, Basil Valentine from ACR is joining us now, but also a very special guest from the United States. He's a professor at New York University, NYU, and he's done extensive work on this very subject that we're discussing today. His name is Mark Crispin Miller, who's joining us on the live link right now. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Patrick. Nice to be with you virtually.
It's great to be with you too, Mark. And as we were talking before, there's so many different facets to this situation, and a lot of people are comparing this to Florida in 2000 as a kind of an example of holding up the result when Florida was, I think, 37 days until it was. They finally had a resolution of sorts. Of course, not everybody was happy with that resolution, but now we have 6, possibly 7 states in play. Now, it's difficult to say where this is going to end, Mark, but just, first things first, Mark, when you were watching this unfold on the evening of November 3rd, did you have any familiar thoughts going through your head as this was happening in front of your eyes?
Oh, absolutely. What's happening now is, on the one hand, more egregious in many ways than what we've seen before, but in a fundamental way, it's as they say, déjà vu all over again. I mean, by now, the spectacle of an election that seems to be heading toward a very clear resolution, suddenly, late at night, turns dramatically. And there's an upset victory. This happened in 2000, right? Florida. There was a lot of very late-night drama. Gore had conceded, and then an aide told him that there were really no grounds to concede, and he took his concession back. And then, as you say, for 36 days he fought it. And all the media were urging him to fold. We'll get to that, I suppose, momentarily. 4 years later, the same thing happened. All the exit polls said that John Kerry had won. The smart money in Vegas said he was going to win. Bush had a lot of demerits. He only really seemed to have strong backing from the Christian right, etc. And then, unaccountably, he won in Ohio, where there were myriad anomalies and irregularities, and now we know that it was actually stolen. He folded overnight after having promised that help is on the way. That was the theme of his speech at the Democratic National Convention. And then it happened again 4 years ago. People don't seem to appreciate the fact that Trump didn't really expect to win, and I believe didn't even want to win. He went home early on election night. It was clearly going to be a blowout for Hillary Clinton, despite all her baggage and her really miserable performance as a candidate. She was headed to victory, and the polls were not wrong. And I think that the Trump team's own polls predicted she was going to win. And not many people know this. It comes from that guy, Anthony Scaramucci, who was Trump's media person for about 10 minutes. he tells us that they didn't even have an acceptance speech written. You know, I think Trump wanted to go home, go to bed, get up early, and start his TV network because, you know, he's a flaming narcissist, and that was really all he was interested in. Lo and behold, he's president. So it happened again the other night that Trump is headed toward victory, and then in the dead of night, there are a couple of big vote drops in Wisconsin and Michigan. In one of them, I think in Michigan, every single vote, it's over 130,000 votes, are all for Biden. Not one for Trump, not one for Joe Jorgensen, not one for Brock Pierce, right? That's what we call an anomaly. And what I want to say specifically about all this is, let me preface it by telling or reminding your listeners that I spent years really fighting to put the urgent subject of election fraud and the dire need to reform the U.S. voting system on the national radar screen. It seemed to me that this was such a serious problem that there had to be a national debate about it. I wrote a book called Fooled Again, which was an analysis of how the 2004 election was stolen. A couple years later, I edited a book called Loser Take All, which is a collection of essays by various election integrity activists. I was blacked out by the corporate media. I was called a conspiracy theorist by the left press, interestingly. But there were a few of us who fought this fight, Bobby Kennedy Jr., Steve Freeman, and others, Bob Vitrakis. We tried and tried to get some traction for this all-important subject. The Democrats were completely uninterested. And as I say, we were called conspiracy theorists. It was the first time I was called that. I've been called that ever since. What's especially troubling to me now, Patrick, is the fact that there are many flagrant signs of theft, okay, in this election. Signs of theft, I'm saying. I'm not saying I know it was stolen. I'm saying that there are many red flags, and they're exactly the same kind of red flags that went up in 2000, that went up in 2004, that went up in 2016 around the Democratic nomination, which was demonstrably stolen from Bernie Sanders. And I believe there's, significant red flags from last summer in this Democratic convention battle. I think that Biden's capturing the nomination is extremely dubious. And here we have them again, and I think we have more of them than we had last time. And I could go through a long list. I don't even have an exhaustive list. The evidence keeps pouring in, evidence of all kinds, signs, that is to say, signs of all kinds. But this time, I notice that many of the people in the election integrity movement, my former allies, are poo-pooing any reference to those signs as conspiracy theory, which is exactly what the Republicans did in 2004. Now, there was out of Ohio, after the 2004 election, the Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee, led by John Conyers, did a report about Ohio. And it's a very detailed, solid piece of research that made quite clear that Ohio had evidently been stolen, that Bush Cheney's victory there, as Ohio goes, so goes the nation, was highly questionable and had to be investigated. The Republicans on the committee boycotted that study, even though they were invited. And then there was a big discussion of that report in the House, and it was clearly scripted because every Republican, they were all saying essentially the same things. This is all in the first chapter of my book, Fooled Again. They kept saying it was conspiracy theory, there was nothing to it, Bush won the election fair and square, and this was re-echoed by the corporate media, okay? So the Republican Party and the corporate media, including the so-called liberal media, were ignoring the tons of evidence that was adduced by people like me, by the election integrity movement. We were all frustrated. We were all, tearing our hair out. We just couldn't understand why this was being ignored, so widely, and even by the Democrats, okay? They weren't even particularly interested. Well, now the people in that movement, not all of them, but many of them, seem to have devolved into beat Trump operatives. And my view is that this fight is worth fighting and must be fought, not to benefit either party. I mean, I haven't voted Democratic since 1992. I have no use for that party. I certainly have no use for Donald Trump. But I do believe in honoring the will of the electorate. And the red flags in this last election are so many and so obvious and are crying out so loudly for a closer study that I am really appalled to see so many people who are happy with the outcome just junking principle here and rolling with it, And I don't think it's a party matter. I don't think it's ultimately a partisan contest. And I want to add that having thought all of this over very carefully all these years, I actually believe that it never was, at least in this millennium, really a party matter. I think that these decisions are taken at a higher level. I mean, nothing else can explain the bizarre acquiescence of the Democrats. Their weird silence on their own defeats, even when they know that those defeats were illegitimate. The fact that the subject is taboo, you cannot talk about it, other than to say that Russia somehow stole the election. That you can say, but even that, you can't say that they rigged the machines. Okay, that was never part of the charge. It was that they used Facebook or they flooded the atmosphere with, pro-Trump propaganda, blah, blah, blah. But the reality of election theft through computerized voting and vote counting, that is a forbidden subject, okay? This tells us that it's larger forces at play that both decide the outcome of our elections and that sort of determine how we're allowed to think and talk about the need for a far stronger and more reliable voting system.
Yes, and things in 2020 are arguably different. I want to get your comment on this as well, Mark, on the political side. In 2020, it's a very different political landscape than in 2000, let's say. There's been a kind of a transformation, if you will, whereby the Republican Party, at least based on the results of this last election, seem to be garnering much more support from the working class. So, right. We're talking about the potential, the danger here, Mark, if the confidence is lost in the election systems, you really have a dangerous disconnect here with a large section of the American working class. And if you add that with a populist movement, that could really cause tremors, or it could render democracy as we're used to it anyway in America, kind of like useless going forward. If there's not if the confidence isn't there in the system, I don't know. I'm very worried about this impasse right now, Mark. I want to get your thoughts on the political ramifications of it.
Oh, that's a very important aspect of this whole discussion. The Republicans routinely stole elections for years, especially after Reagan, who was fairly popular, not as popular as the media said, but popular. After that, the party was basically hijacked by the Christian right for its own purposes. It was still serving Wall Street and corporate interests. I mean, that's always been the function of both parties. But the Republicans did have a kind of grassroots support of theocratic Christianists, and they had a tremendous amount of power there. And so their agenda was unpopular. They therefore had to steal elections. I mean, they didn't do it just out of demonic malice. They did it out of necessity. They had to shrink the pool of eligible voters through vote suppression. That's step one. And then they had to take step two, which is to fiddle with the vote count on Election Day through electronic means. So they did that. Well, this has changed somewhat in that the Democratic Party is now the party that is promoting an unpopular agenda. The Democratic Party is the party of lockdown. The Democratic Party is the party of censorship. The Democratic Party is now the party of war. Not that the Republicans don't support war as well, but the Democrats have backed into the position of the far right in the 50s, demonizing Russia. Russia, this obsession with Putin, this notion that he's somehow Stalin 2.0 and he's trying to take over the world. This is demented. There was nothing to Russiagate. It ultimately collapsed, but they never gave it up. So they're the party of war, and they are, in fact, a party that detests the working class, right? Now, they fetishize race, so they will talk about, disadvantaged black people and so on. But overall, the working class, inasmuch as it is, in fact, a class of many races, they have no use for them. They have contempt for them. They think that they're stupid. They think that they're deplorables. And all those people know that because the Democrats make no secret of it. On top of which, they are also the party of gender identity, which makes them, in effect, misogynistic. It makes them anti-feminist because they're perfectly fine with, for example, biological males competing in girls' and women's sports. They don't seem to have a problem with radical medical intervention in the sexual development of children. Now, however one feels about those issues, we can all agree that they're not popular. It's not a popular position. That is a kind of an eccentric position and peculiar to blue enclaves. So what I'm saying is the Democratic Party is now the party that's pushing an unpopular agenda. Trump, who I think is a phony, has successfully appealed to the working class and to his populist base by speaking to those people's concerns. And they're not just racists. I mean, he has some black support. He has a lot of Hispanic support. This notion that everybody who has voted for him is some kind of Nazi is just a propaganda meme. So the Democrats now have had to steal. I'm assuming that those signs we're seeing from the other night, where there's smoke, there's fire. So it's not a stretch of the imagination to say that they would resort to theft in order to realize their agenda, which, again, I want to stress, I don't think is their agenda. I think the Great Reset is in the works, this radical elite program to completely remake global society and the economy. So the Democrats are being used to front for this. I think that if Trump were president, it would happen anyway. I don't think he has the power or even necessarily the desire to resist it. But it might be slowed down a little bit if his constituency had a voice in the executive branch. Mm-hmm. So, as to the question of public confidence in the viability of electoral democracy here, I think that, to coin a phrase, our chickens are now coming home to roost. I think that the system really lost all legitimacy some time ago. I've said before, and I'll say again, I think that 2020 has been on its way since 1963, which was a bloody coup, effected in broad daylight in the streets of Dallas. And this was pulled off in order to ensure that a very popular president who would be running on a kind of peace agenda had successfully pushed for the passage of the partial nuclear test ban treaty and wanted to come to terms with the Soviet Union and quietly was planning to pull out of Vietnam The Joint Chiefs didn't want that. The military-industrial complex didn't want that. Wall Street didn't want Kennedy's kind of economic program. The eugenicists, like the Rockefellers and so on, the population control movement, as it called itself, and still does, they had a kind of adversary in the White House, as well as in Bobby Kennedy. So that wasn't going to be allowed to take place. And it's interesting to note, let me add, that the first election in which votes were counted by computer, not all votes, but many votes were counted by computer, was in 1964. I think that that innovation and the 25th Amendment, which was passed after the assassination, to enable the vice president to take the president's position should the president be deemed unfit. These were ways to make sure that the democratic system would never miscarry again. Would never again, bring in a president who would stand in the way of the war machine. And there were some subsequent glitches. I think there's evidence that Watergate was actually a silent coup. There are several very compelling books that make that case because of détente, because of Nixon's overture to China, because of his animus against the CIA, for his own reasons. But thereafter, I think that all our presidents have basically been safe bets, so that we have really, over the decades, witnessed the, complete capture of the election system. And it's now sort of total. The media now is completely unified, dominated by 5 multinational corporations that are very close to the government. The social media giants are also very close to the highest powers. So, what you describe as a kind of disconnect, is a necessity in a way, because you've got the majority of people on the one hand who are, rightly concerned about their survival and want to live decent human lives. They want to have families. They want to have jobs. They want to have intact communities. And then you've got all these powerful corporate and other elite interests on the other hand, which collectively have other plans for the rest of us. I think that Trump will put up a fight. There will be a legal challenge. I believe they have some grounds. I mean, it's interesting to study this phase of the narrative, but I think that in the long run, the outcome is assured, and we have to be thinking ahead. If we want to ever get back to something like democracy, a real democracy, as opposed to a mobocracy, with elite puppet masters. So, I'm just saying again what I've said for 20 years, which is that legitimate elections are crucial, even though the two parties are, the two wings on a single bird of prey, as Upton Sinclair once put it. Within the Democratic Party and even within the Republican Party, there have been some congressional candidates who are really honest and want to do the right thing. They're all driven out by the corruption of the voting system. Cynthia McKinney in Georgia, Dennis Kucinich in Ohio, they are quote unquote defeated in their re-election bids. And this is because the election system has been completely gamed, needs to be reformed radically, which is something that we could do very simply. I could get into that. It wouldn't be hard at all to return us to something like a reliable voting system. But neither party wants it. The press is uninterested in it. Liberals don't care about it, neither do progressives. They actually never have. So the question is, how do we do it? And is it possible? And if so, how can it be done?
Well, you're probably familiar with Tulsi Gabbard tabled I believe, a bill just along these very lines. I don't know if you're familiar with the details of what she's proposing, but she pushed that out during the debates, I believe, and absolutely a wall of silence fell. I mean, it was as if she said some blasphemy or something.
That's absolutely right. That's what happened when she brought it up. That's what always happens. Well, listen, let me ask you. I mean, I was a staunch Bernie supporter twice. Where was he? You know, why didn't he utter a peep after the manifest theft of his nomination? I mean, as for the one 4 years ago, there's a long, detailed study called Democracy Lost by a group called Election Justice USA. I think it's 108 pages. They go chapter and verse, state after state, caucus, well, not caucuses then, there's caucuses this year, primary after primary. It was clearly stolen. Vote suppression clearly carried out by the Democrats, and electronic fraud probably pulled off by Republican operatives. If we're going to talk about this as a partisan drama, it would be because they didn't want, Trump to be running against Bernie. But my question is, why has Bernie been silent? And why did he then... What's that?
Oh, no, go ahead. Finish, Mark. Finish your sentence.
Yeah, he's been completely silent, which is a betrayal of his supporters. I mean, the significant thing isn't that he was robbed. The significant thing is that all the people who voted for him were robbed. Many, he had more young supporters than any other candidate. This is the first time they got politically engaged. He screwed them. He just kept his mouth shut. I have nothing but contempt for that. Now, who has spoken up? What presidential candidate has spoken up about election theft? It was Jill Stein, right? Jill Stein, who's not a Democrat, but a Green, and against the wishes even of many people in her own party, made a big issue out of the swing state votes in 2016, and bravely and successfully mounted a fundraising drive to pay the obscene amounts of money it costs to get recounts going in those three states. And she unearthed a lot of really significant evidence that nobody has talked about. It's been reported by no media outlet anywhere. She has taken immense amounts of abuse. I think her life has been threatened. She was accused of being a Russian troll and all this stuff, just for trying to get at some truth about what happened in that election. Not for her own sake. She didn't have a prayer of being, a contender politically, but because she believes in that crucial principle of fair elections. That the outcomes of our elections should reflect the will of the electorate. That's fundamental. It's inarguable. And yet so few people seem to believe in it. Barbara Lee, God bless her, Representative Barbara Lee, tweeted out a photo of a theater marquee in, I think it's in Santa Monica, saying that every vote must be counted. She tweeted a photo of that with a meme of a thumbs up. That's a real patriot. Okay, that's a real American in the best sense. Somebody who believes in that, believes in a democratic republic. The attack on election integrity, or I should say the subversion of election integrity, the use of that movement to promote the agenda of one side is a great moral collapse and a sign that things have really gone very, very wrong, just like the transformation of the Democratic Party into a war party, into an anti-working class party, into a lockdown party, into a mandatory vaccination party. I think there's an American majority that not only doesn't want that, but that will resist it. And I'm afraid we're heading toward that moment. I don't know what to say beyond that.
Well, the count every vote, I noticed that was a big, they're really pushing that talking point. Nancy Pelosi Joe Biden, Kamala Harris. This was on the eve of the election, and then the day after, it was, we need to count every vote. They tweeted it, those very words. That was on message. And then all of a sudden, they rushed the day after, rushing to, after NBC and the AP declared Biden to be the winner. Now they're saying, don't count every vote. Meanwhile, they're still counting.
Right, no, I know. Oceania has always been at war with East Asia, right? Remember that?
Yeah.
From that, it's the same thing. The propaganda line shifts. I think Basil wanted to say something.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Mark. I just wanted to say, I thought it was very interesting the point you made about election theft / vote fraud being beyond over and above the party level.
Right.
And I wonder if you agree with me whether or not the unseen hand, the deep state, although I don't think that term has quite the same resonance now as it did when Peter Dale Scott first coined it 20 years ago, but whether or not it's the same hidden hand that put Bush in power in 2000 and particularly in 2004 is now working for Biden in 2020. The same neocon hand, the same national security state. Who the individuals are, how the organization works, I don't know. But that would back up my thesis, which is that the parties themselves are merely empty vehicles that are periodically resprayed and presented to the electorate as new by shoddy second-hand car salesmen, when in fact the buyer, the electorate, have no idea what's under the hood or in which direction it's going to be going.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. It's important to note that, well, first of all, the neocons are a faction of the Republican Party. They also include some Democrats. I think it does include that faction, and yet it's also even bigger than that. I mean, we're talking about the same war machine that whacked JFK.
Right.
They don't want that business ever to be interrupted. But there's
right.
also a kind of a long-standing elite program of depopulation, of total control of humanity and the food supply, stuff that people will laugh off as conspiracy theory. But let me say something about that. That phrase, that weaponized phrase, was birthed by the CIA in 1967. The reason why we've all internalized it is that starting in 1967, that phrase began to be used back then to discredit critics of the Warren Report. And this is all laid out in a memo that the CIA sent its station chiefs worldwide, Memo 1035-960, which basically instructed all those personnel worldwide to use their media assets to discredit the work of these conspiracy theorists, which is a phrase that actually had never been used before. And it recommended certain, sort of facile pseudo-arguments that reviewers could use in their attacks on people like Mark Lane and others who were rightly questioning the Warren Report, which was kind of a joke. Well, that phrase never stopped being used. It was used after King's assassination, after Bobby's. It was used after the October surprise in 1980, after Iran-Contra, after 9/11. And now it's used all the time by pretty much everybody. I mean, it's become far more widely used and ferociously used than ever before. And fake news is a kind of offshoot of conspiracy theory. Well, what I'm saying is that the CIA's involvement in election theft was prodigious all along for decades, from the beginning. The Pike Committee, there were two congressional investigations of the CIA in the mid-'70s. There's the Church Committee, which everybody's heard of. That was in the Senate. In the House was the Pike Committee, which is not as well known. Pike Committee's relationship with the CIA was much rockier than the relationship that the Church Committee had with the agency. They were more combative. They wanted more stuff that the agency wasn't willing to give them. So they were stonewalled, they were thwarted, and the first third of their eventual report is all about the difficulty they had even getting information out of the CIA. As soon as that report was completed, the House amazingly classified it so that some big chunks of it ended up running in the Village Voice, and this led to, high-level investigations, and it's too complicated to go into. You could only get a copy, and still can only get a copy from the UK. It's a paperback edition with an introduction by Philip Agee. I bring it up because this little study makes clear that the CIA's involvement in what they call election work by the mid-'70s accounted for roughly a third of what the CIA was doing worldwide. Another third was propaganda. Okay, we know they do a tremendous amount of that. But election work, that means stealing elections all over the world. That's one of the first things they did. It wasn't an outright theft exactly, but in Italy in 1948, 1 year after the CIA was formed, they swung into action to make sure that the communists were defeated in the Italian elections. And they used every propaganda means at their disposal. They used some bully boy tactics at the street level, but they got their wish. They got what they wanted. And then from then on, they've been interfering in elections, serially everywhere. And so I have a feeling that the reason why the subject is taboo, the reason why you're pilloried and ridiculed even for bringing it up is that it's one of those things that might, you follow those breadcrumbs, they might lead back to the intelligence services. So, I do think that, and the CIA, let me add, is to some extent a rogue organization, but it's basically a middleman. It's an instrument of much larger interests. Philip Agee called it the secret police of American capitalism. When you see the entire establishment turning on a candidate and supporting his opponent, all the media, even Fox News now has turned against Trump. The entire Democratic Party, many in the Republican Party, it's clear that this is not just a party matter. The party conflict is just a sideshow that helps to keep us distracted from, the war on us that's being waged from a level far higher than where the parties operate. It's a war that keeps, and it's essential to keep us not only distracted but divided. So we're all at each other's throats, and it's red versus blue, it's black versus white, etc. It's the oldest imperial game in the book, and they're playing it very skillfully. So what can one say?
Well, those divisions as well seem to be sort of deeper and nastier in 2020 than ever before. As you say, the two parties are two wings of the same bird of prey. But as we mentioned in the first hour, Democrats and MSNBC anchors now are talking about eradicating the Trumpian Republican Party and its supporters. There's a vitriol in American political discourse that wasn't there 50 years ago? Or am I remembering the 70s and 80s as halcyon days that never were?
Well, they weren't halcyon days, but there was nothing like this. I mean, this is really, right. This feels totalitarian. This is a kind of, it reminds me of Gleichschaltung, the German word for it's kind of like streamlining. It's what the Nazis did, when they just took over all major cultural and political institutions by staffing them with their own people, And I mean, I'm under fire at NYU. We don't have to get into this, but, it's basically for failing to adhere to the COVID orthodoxy And also, lately, it's, for various imagined crimes against social justice, So that the social justice aspect of this whole struggle is crucial, because that's what enables the depiction of all Trump supporters as white supremacists, It's very crude and very dangerous, and it's all about censorship, deplatforming, firing. So I speak to you as somebody who's himself a victim of this. But Basil, you're absolutely right. This is a new thing, and it is as new as the Democratic Party's transformation into a really kind of frightening totalitarian alliance or front. I don't recognize it. I did a Instagram conversation with Bobby Kennedy Jr. a few weeks ago, and we agreed we don't recognize this Democratic Party. I think it's time for us to drop the whole left-right division. Left means nothing anymore. It's not about being against war. It's not about curbing corporate power. It's not about strengthening the working class. It's not even really about protecting the environment. I don't care how much they scream about climate change. It's about something else. And the right, well, what does that mean? If it means the Christianist right, the theocrats, well, that's something we should worry about. Does it mean the sort of neo-Nazi right? The Proud Boys, if I'm describing them accurately, that's problematic too. But does it mean the libertarian right? Does it mean people who believe in freedom? Well, it seems to. When the Democrats pillory people who talk about freedom and lump them in together with Nazis who don't believe in freedom,
I agree.
We're talking about.
Sorry, go on, finish. I'm just saying that the nomenclature has all become completely ridiculous. It's all utterly meaningless.
Right.
I mean, in Britain, with respect to the lockdown, obviously we have a right-wing government headed by Boris Johnson, and yet people protesting against the lockdown are dubbed neo-fascists.
Yeah, right. It makes no sense. Well, I mean, look, it's a double standard. I see the whole post-George Floyd moment as the second act of the horrendous 2020 melodrama, which is meant to kind of break the nations of the world and subjugate humanity, right? Certainly in the United States, that's the program. So COVID was Act One. The COVID crisis at its height was, Act One. And that dealt a body blow to the independent American economy, the mom and pop stores and so on, independent businesses. Then the George Floyd protests affected the second step of that, And interestingly, we talked a moment ago briefly about the kind of flexibility of the propaganda mind, that you shift from wanting to count every vote to not wanting to count every vote. Well, all of a sudden, after, months of being told that any congregation was extremely dangerous and would kill grandma, you got all these BLM assemblies, and somehow they're not dangerous, They got a pass. It's like those people don't catch COVID and they don't transmit it. And they weren't all wearing masks, not that those work, right? So that was, a clear sign that the social justice propaganda is a key part of this whole thing, because while those protests were perfectly okay, protests against the lockdowns were all dismissed as Nazi gatherings, right? And then, there were a few very high-profile shows of force by white supremacists. There was one in Lansing, Michigan, around the time of a larger protest against Governor Whitmer's really draconian lockdown policy. There was this apparent storming of the State House in Lansing by these armed white supremacists that I think was just a bunch of bull. I mean, I think it was staged. I don't believe it. Just as this kidnapping plot, these white supremacists were going to kidnap the governor. This was, more recent. Well, it turns out that was just another instance of an FBI infiltrator manipulating some bunch of dim bulbs into thinking they were going to kidnap the governor. But it got enormous amounts of publicity. Okay, when Bobby Kennedy spoke in Berlin, gave that amazing speech, about a month or so ago, over 1 million people. All the media were, predicting it would be a Nazi gathering. It was nothing of the kind. But around the same time, a bunch of neo-Nazis stormed the Reichstag. This got tremendous play. Okay, if people can't see that these are propaganda exercises, it seems to me that there's no hope for them, or they just have a lot to learn. This kind of spectacle is straight out of the playbook. It's been used all over the place for decades. It's a key ingredient of the color revolution, and it's going on now. So by now I take it as axiomatic that if all the media is reporting something, it's probably false. And it was probably, in many cases, something that was orchestrated. But I wouldn't believe it. It's that bad. It is really that bad.
No,
yeah, I noticed. Go on, Patrick. Yeah, you go on, Patrick.
No, I'm just going to add, Mark. The Proud Boys, just on that front, that started out as kind of a social media meme. Gavin McInnes, formerly of Vice magazine.
Oh yeah,
he's Canadian actually, but decamped in New York, and he was sort of running that as a kind of a counter against the kind of social justice triggered left. It was to antagonize the university. Triggered left and whatnot, and the media built it up. CNN, NBC, they built it up to like it's Hell's Angels basically,
absolutely.
But they created that with the spectacle of Charlottesville, which had FBI informants active in the upper echelons of the so-called right wing. There, one of them was outed. In a radio host who was doing provocative stuff as well. He was an FBI informant. I mean, the place was just, swarming with various bad actors, basically. And
definitely.
Yeah, but go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that, that kind of thing. There was a black guy, I forget his name. He's a conservative, and he does his own podcast.
Anthony Logan, I think.
That's right. It was Anthony Logan, and he interviewed a woman who had been in a restaurant in Charlottesville just before the clash commenced, and he was interviewing her, and she sounded wholly credible. She was completely traumatized. She kept breaking down into tears. She said that several buses pulled up and parked in this alley next to the restaurant, and all these demonstrators, so-called, from either side poured into the place and started, beating the crap out of people. It was like they were getting warmed up, but they weren't just one side or the other. They were wearing BLM T-shirts. Some were wearing, Klan regalia or whatever it was, and it was kind of surreal and nightmarish. Everybody had to flee out the rear of the place. Some people got beat up. But this, when I heard this, it immediately reminded me of what I had learned not long before from a documentary on the CIA coup in Iran, 1953, which is the first of their successful destabilization efforts. There's a guy being interviewed talking about street fights in Tehran between communists and anti-communists, right? Both sides were just gangsters, basically paid by the coup masters. They weren't communists or anti-communists. They were thugs, and they were crisis actors, basically. So they staged a pitched battle, and it was reported as this, melee, suggesting a kind of breakdown of political order, which eased the ouster of Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected prime minister who wanted to nationalize British oil. Well, he couldn't do that. So they swung into action, the CIA and the British, and they did it, and they used that kind of trick, and that's what Charlottesville reminded me of. You know, that's what we're living through.
Yeah, the last note on Charlottesville, and the reason I mentioned Charlottesville because that Joe Biden launched his campaign, his presidential campaign, on the back of Charlottesville. That was his big sort of coming out, speech, and he said, "I'm fighting for the soul of the nation." When I saw the tiki torches, the Walmart $7 tiki torches at Charlottesville, it moved me to run for president and so forth. But James Field is the I think it was 19 or 20-year-old young guy who was convicted, got 2 life sentences, I think, for killing, running his car into and killing an activist. We find out after the trial that he had diagnosed multiple personality schizophrenia from the age of 8. Was it abuse, all sorts of things, and parents were, in and out of whatever. And, you look at the MO, the background of this kid, and then he was dropped into this, neo-Nazi group with it, posed in a few photos on social media. And really the whole story was built around, but nobody asked this question while he was he's really messed up, mentally. And normally that would come out in the trial, but it almost wasn't mentioned in the press until months later during the sentencing.
I never heard that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. If you have an opportunity, I will drop a link, hopefully, if I can remember, to you after the show. But I find the whole thing just really fascinating. The deeper I go into that event, the more interesting it gets.
Well, that's right. And I want to say as well that we would be in much better shape as a society and as a nation if people understood how propaganda works. I used to say this about media studies. I used to say that, media studies should be taught a mandatory part of every high school and college curriculum so people know how the media works, how ownership works, how advertiser dollars affect content. And I still believe that. But that's related to, that's a part of a larger necessity, which is the need to grasp how propaganda operates. That's really important. And in line with that, and this is based on what you just said, in line with that is the need for us to study the darker side of our own history, okay? And by that, I don't just mean slavery, which we do now study and which we should study. I'm talking about post-war history. I'm talking about, the intelligence colossus. I'm talking about all the stuff that's dismissed as conspiracy theory. MK Ultra is a program that's highly relevant to what you just noted about James Field. The use, if not the creation, of damaged persons who can then be shuffled around and used as pawns in these theatrical exercises. It turns out. Well, this is a subject we could talk about for a whole separate hour. But the point is, I find that the ignorance of the CIA's past and the FBI's and so on is it's rampant. It's nobody knows anything about any of this stuff. There was this brief golden moment in the 70s when it all began to come to light, just a piece of it, but it was really coming to light because of those congressional inquiries, because of Watergate, because the Vietnam War had gone so badly awry. The American people were kind of ready for some truth, That's when we had these amazing movies come out of Hollywood, like Godfather 2 and Chinatown. These are big budget productions, and they actually shed an honest light on the nature of American power, the CIA swung into action and made sure that moment ended soon. And the guy who took over the agency to steer it through that crisis was George Bush Sr., It was his 1 year as CIA director that basically handed him that assignment. He dealt with the Church Committee and so on. He made sure they said very little about CIA involvement in the media. He made sure they said nothing about CIA involvement in academia, which was extensive and still is, but nobody knows about any of it. So there's been a kind of long winter of mass ignorance of that crucial history, and it's not bliss, right? If ignorance is bliss, why are so many people taking drugs?
Yeah, if I could just jump in one last time, here in the UK, of course, our BBC has degenerated into a propaganda organization. And I think it's fair to say that in the United States, even 25 or 30 years ago, you had greater plurality of media opinion and, a more interested media in the subjects that have now become unmentionable, but also the total failure of academia. But with the exception of your good self, where are American universities with respect to JFK, 9/11, the Church Committee, any of it, MK Ultra, any of them? They're nowhere to be seen,
Well, I'm afraid I can't argue.
Funding questions, do you know what I mean? You talk about that, we cut off your funding, blah, blah, blah. But what happened to tenure,
No kidding. I mean, I have tenure. I've been teaching at NYU since 1997. And a lot of my colleagues want me fired, for heresy, I suppose. And it has to do really with what we're talking about. It's not just what I said about masks, or the reading that I assigned about masks, which is what moved some student to flip out on me, took to Twitter and demanded I be fired, for not even assigning, and recommending that the class read scientific studies on the effectiveness of masks. Studies pro and con, both. She was so angered she took to Twitter and said I should be fired. And NYU basically took her side, okay? Yeah, tenure. Tenure is there in order to protect those who go against the grain, who venture unpopular, unorthodox views and do research that would put certain, official narratives into question. I believe it became important in the first place, because of the hostility to pacifism in World War I. I may be misremembering this, but the point is, it was based on an enlightened understanding of the need to protect independent intellectual inquiry from state and corporate pressure, right? So I'm afraid that most of the people who have it now don't have any need for it, because their work doesn't put them at any risk, And Basil, you've brought up a crucial aspect of this whole problem. How this happened, how funding streams came to determine the kind of work people do, the subjects that cannot be discussed by academics because no one will fund them. There's no work on Fukushima, for example, a subject that never comes up in the media, while that site continues to irradiate the Pacific Ocean with catastrophic consequences for marine life and human life as far to the east as the west coast of the United States and Canada. Never gets discussed, and nobody can get any grant money to study it. Well, that's really beyond worrisome. But what it means is that the entire field of intellectual endeavor has become corrupted, and it requires tremendous amounts of personal courage and resourcefulness in order to even do work that needs to be done.
Yeah, completely neutered.
Neutered. That's a better word.
Well, that's Piers Robinson. He's in their Institute for Propaganda Studies. I'm sure they've done a lot in that department. And like you said, Mark,
I'm on the board of that.
Yes, exactly. So there are some good academics, really trying to hold the line on that issue. But as you said, Mark, the most important aspect is that if you're not taking that into account when you're looking at any particular event or any situation politically or geopolitically, if you're not taking the propaganda side into consideration, then it's very likely that you will not really know what you're looking at.
That's exactly right. You put that very well. You don't know what you're looking at. My impulse is always to say, you don't know what you're talking about, right? People argue on the basis of nothing, but you don't know what you're looking at is an even more apt, because we're all looking at the same thing. But all too many people see what they're intended to see. And it is, what's happened to the BBC has happened to the entire American media, including the left press. I don't see any difference between Democracy Now! And the New York Times. I don't. I don't even see any difference between Noam Chomsky and Thomas Friedman. I mean, they've all kind of blended into one another. It's really something. All the biggest stars on the left are pro-lockdown. They won't talk about the Great Reset. Naomi Klein, Amy Goodman, Noam Chomsky. I could go on naming these, and I know them all. I have appeared with them, I've talked to them, I've worked with them, but the left that was is just not the left that is, and possibly it never was what it seemed to be in some cases. Who will know, right? But the fact is, as Basil notes, we got to drop the nomenclature. It's a waste of time. It's a distraction. There are those of us who believe in freedom and truth. I know that sounds corny, who are genuine patriots and want the best for people. And there are those who don't. Yeah. They may think they do because they're terrified, but when you're terrified, it brings out the worst in you, and we're seeing the worst come out in a lot of people now. I mean, the absolute worst.
Yeah, and last thing I'll say is we're going to wrap up in a minute, but, going back to the Bernie Sanders issue, Mark, I was excited the race I wanted to see was Trump-Sanders, because although I'm not a proponent of all of Bernie's policies, I thought that having that clash would be tremendous in terms of political discourse, in terms of engaging people and really coming to practical solutions through that process, and really seeing whether, having this generation, come up and really challenging a lot of state ideas within the establishment that have been there for decades and decades. I thought this was a great opportunity. It could be a great moment in history to have opposition and to have counterpoints. It didn't happen. It didn't happen.
You're so right. That was the contest that Gore Vidal used to say we really very badly needed. He used to say we need to have an election in which someone on the sort of democratic socialist left squares off against some free market buccaneer. That those two antithetical notions should have it out. That would have happened, Bernie versus Trump. But obviously that wasn't in the cards. So we got what we got, which was, Tweedledum and Tweedledummer, and not much difference between them, other than the fact that Trump at least feigned opposition to lockdown and feigned an unwillingness to launch mandatory vaccination. As I say, I don't trust him, but his constituents include people who are genuinely libertarian. And so that's the key difference between the two sides. Otherwise, I think that I actually think Biden's worse, to tell you the truth, because Trump at least hasn't started any new wars or has not fronted for any new wars. I think the ones that were ongoing, he may have ramped up. So I'm not about to give him the Nobel Peace Prize or anything. He also ramped up Obama's drone war, I've read. But he didn't start any new ones. Whereas a Biden, Harris, Clinton regime will definitely, get that war machine back in business again. And that will happen, in conjunction with COVID panic and climate change and social justice in all sorts of new and newly horrible ways, I expect,
If you look at the Great Reset agenda from Davos, from the World Economic Forum, that's what you just said there, Mark, is chapter and verse of this kind of the agenda that they have. Social justice it features majorly. Of course, the climate change issue is baked in there, and lockdown, pandemic, COVID, and international biosurveillance and lower economic activity, transitioning away from carbon economy and all these things. That's pretty much the Biden-Harris platform. I think looks very much like Charlton with Davos, as you said.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's right. People
do you think, lastly, Mark, one last question, Mark, do you think Trump stands any chance at all of overturning the result in the courts?
Well, it is possible that he'll get a legal decision in his favor. The Supreme Court is definitely packed with people who would back him, I think. I'm being very tentative here because who knows? But I don't think that will ultimately make any difference. I think that we've already been warned repeatedly or alerted to the likelihood, if not the inevitability, of some kind of military intervention and mass, color revolution type street chaos around the White House. I can easily picture that. I don't think it's even speculation. I think it's fact. So what will ultimately happen will be the imposition of something pretty draconian, and that will serve to realize that agenda, which is a global agenda. It's not national. So people have got to stop, focusing on the street theater and the partisan sideshow to some extent, and keep an eye cocked up at that higher level, and just try to be a little more detached and less emotional.
Yeah. Well said.
That's all we have time for in this segment, Mark, and I really appreciate you spending time with us this weekend and on the show. And it was a great discussion. And we'll give your book a shout out again. Fooled Again, Mark Crispin Miller. And also we put a link to your website, Mark, up on the show page right now, so people can go there. And give a shout out as well, Mark, of any lists or anything that people can see your work or subscribe to.
Well, if they join my listserv, which they can do at the website, they'll get the emails I send out. I try to send out daily, sometimes including my own little writings, but mostly just pieces from the global and local and independent press that offer information that we don't often hear. I would also ask that they sign my petition, because it's a petition in defense of academic freedom and free speech, not just for me. It's prompted by my plight at NYU, but it's really a protest against censorship of all kinds, going back decades. Calling people conspiracy theorists or anti-vaxxers or anti-Semites or whatever slur may be used to shut down discussion, accusing them of hate speech, etc. We've got to be able to talk freely and cordially about important issues. That's becoming increasingly dangerous and difficult as social media locks down and so on. So, they can get my stuff through my website and sign the petition. And otherwise, I don't know what to recommend, because I don't write for any outlet on a regular basis.
No, definitely. I recommend your email blast. It's full of great stories, and you're catching things and highlighting things that are sometimes slipping between the cracks. So I highly recommend it to anybody. If they want to go do that, go click on Mark Crispin Miller's name on the show page at 21st Century Wire. That'll take you through there as well. But thank you very much, Mark, and hopefully
thank you, Mark. Thanks,
Yep.
Mark. It's great to have you on.
It was great to talk to both of you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Well,
Sure.
there he goes, ladies and gentlemen, Mark Crispin Miller, and we highly recommend you go check out his blog, and hopefully we'll have him on for another session in the future. We're going to take a brief break and then wrap things up on the other side here with Basil Valentine during our post-election post-mortem of sorts here at the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. Stick around. We'll be right back.